The Life and Works of Rizal. Good day everyone, I am Shaira G. Pabro, one of your discussant for today, in which I will discuss Rizal's relationship with other propagandists. Before we discuss those propagandists, let us first define what is propaganda movement. Propaganda movement is a literary and cultural organization that aims to increase Spanish awareness of the needs of its colony and to propagate a closer relationship between colony and Spain. So, the propaganda movement was a period of time when native Filipinos were calling for reforms. It lasting approximately from year 1880 to 1886, with the most activity between year 1880 and 1895. Dr. Domingo Abella, the learned director of the National Archives, has made the suggestion that the so-called propaganda movement was misnamed. It should have been called the counter-propaganda movement because its essential task was to counteract the campaign of misinformation that certain Spanish groups were disseminating in Spain and later in Rome. So it was a campaign of information as well as a bid for sympathy. The member of propaganda movement called propagandists or reformists is someone who creates and or disseminates propaganda. A propagandist is also the one who actively creates propaganda material or is involved in spreading it. And the most outstanding propagandist was Jose Rizal. So, aside from being a propagandist, Jose Rizal is also a physician, scholar, and scientist. Jose Rizal became a leader of the reformist movement called Propaganda, an unwavering campaign for political and social freedoms, lobbying the peninsular government using their connections with the liberal Spanish politicians. He wrote unceasingly for the La Solidaridad, which is the mouthpiece of the propaganda. Jose Rizal hoping, as did his fellow propagandists, that the pleas of the Filipinos would be heard by the powers that be. Rizal also wrote two political novels, which is the No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo, which had a wide impact in the Philippines. Lopez Haina, Rizal, and journalist Marcelo del Pilar emerged as the three leading figures of the propaganda movement. So, Rizal produced the two novels that he hoped would succeed in achieving his goals where all other means had failed, but which ultimately led to his death. The other important propagandists include, the first one is Marcelo H. del Pilar, who also known by his pen name Plaridel. He was a Filipino writer, lawyer, journalist, and Freemason. Del Pilar, along with Jose Rizal and Cristiano Lopez Haina, became known as the leaders of the reform movement in Spain. So, Del Pilar was active in anti-prior movement in the islands until obliged to flee to Spain in year 1888, where he became editor of La Solidaridad and assumed leadership of the Filipino community in Spain. So in year 1889, he succeeded Lopez Haina as editor of La Solidaridad, affectionately called La Sol or the Sun. He became its most prolific writer and longtime editor for 6 years until 1895. So during those 5 years as La Solidaridad's editor, Del Pilar single-handedly ran the paper and consequently became the backbone of the entire propaganda movement. So in year 1890, a rivalry developed between Del Pilar and Rizal. This was mainly due to the difference between Del Pilar's editorial policy and Rizal's political beliefs. So on January 1, year 1891, about 90 Filipinos gathered in Madrid. They agreed that a responsible leader should be elected. And to fix the unity among them, among Del Pilar and Rizal, it was agreed to have a vote to elect the responsible leader. Rizal won the two elections but not reached the two-thirds of participants. But he declined because he knew that there were Pilaristas that did not like his views and personality. The next propagandist was Antonio Luna, born on October 29, year 1866 in Urbistondo, Binondo, Manila. Antonio Luna was 5 years younger than Jose Rizal. Antonio was the youngest of the 7 children of Joaquin Luna and Laurenia Novicio Ancheta. In Europe, he collaborated with other Filipino expatriates like Rizal in working for the propaganda movement. So in writing for La Solidaridad, he was contribute the article Impressions, which discuss Spanish unique traditions and customs under the pen name Tagailog. And aside from that, he also managed the paper La Independencia. In year 1889, a Spanish writer, Pablo Mirdeas, attacked Antonio Luna in the Barcelona newspaper, which is the El Pueblo Soberano. So as Rizal's defense of his friend Luna, he wrote the article Inconsecuencias or Inconsequences, which was published on November 30, year 1889. A year after, Rizal challenged Antonio to a duel in a party held by Filipinos in Madrid, and the intoxicated Antonio Luna made negative comments against Nelly Busted. Nelly Busted is the woman he was courting but was said to have been infatuated with Rizal. Jose Rizal, who at that time was not good mood for bearing various problems, was prompted to challenge Luna into a duel. But since Luna apologized to Rizal, the duel was nonetheless aborted and their friendship was restored. When Rizal later decided to formally court Nelly, Antonio gentlemanly conceded to Rizal and even congratulated him through a letter. The next propagandist was Graciano Lopez Jaina. He was a Filipino propagandist, journalist, and orator. He founded the fortnightly patriotic newspaper La Solidaridad, of which he became the first editor. So the mother of Jaina wanted him to become a priest, but Graciano preferred the medicine, and with the financial support from his concerned friends, he took medical courses at the University of Valencia. His thirst for reforms nonetheless took him away from medical studies into writing for patriotic cause and establishing the genesis of the propaganda movement 2 years ahead of Rizal and 9 years before Marcelo del Pilar. So in year 1889, he established a bi-weekly newspaper in Barcelona, which is the La Solidaridad, which became the principal organ of the propaganda movement, and having audiences both in Spain and in the islands. So the contributors of La Solidaridad include Jose Rizal and Dr. Ferdinand Blumentritt. Dr. Ferdinand Blumentritt is an Austrian geographer and ethnologist whom Rizal had met in Germany. Aside from that, Blumentritt is well known among Filipinos for his close relationship with Rizal, because Blumentritt's relationship with Rizal began as early as July year 1886. And also, Marcelo H. del Pilar, who is a reform-minded lawyer that time. Philippine historians regard Lopez Jaina, along with Marcelo H. del Pilar and Jose Rizal, as the triumvirate of Filipino propagandists. So, of these three ilustrados, Lopez Jaina was the first to arrive in Spain and may have begun the propaganda movement, which advocate the reform of the Spanish colony of the Philippines, and which eventually led to the Armed Philippine Revolution that began in Manila in year 1896. So by that, the propaganda movement was a key step towards the Philippine national identity. At the age of 39, Lopez Haina died of tuberculosis on January 20, year 1896, and was buried the following day in an unmarked grave at the Cementerio del Suboeste of Barcelona. And in the same year, Del Pilar died July 4, while Rizal died December 30. Thus ending the great triumvirate of Filipino reformers. Their legacy and death nonetheless inspired other Filipino heroes like Bonifacio and Aguinaldo to fight for the national freedom. Next is Mariano Ponce. He was a Filipino physician, writer, and active member of the propaganda movement in Spain. And he was among the founders of La Solidaridad and Asociación Hispano-Filipino. He afterward took up medicine at the University of Santo Tomas, when Rizal was also attending classes in the institution. So in year 1881, Ponce left for Spain to continue his medical studies at the Universidad Central de Madrid, where Rizal would also enroll as medicine student the following year. So aside from that, Ponce is also the one who willingly helped Rizal in the distribution of the Noli Me Tangere. Ponce must have been so proud to become Rizal's friend, especially because that the author of Noli had become so popular among Filipinos after the novel's publication. In Europe, he met the great Filipino propagandists Jose Rizal, Graciano Lopez Haina, and Marcelo H. del Pilar. So Ponce joined with them and the other propagandists in an anti-Spaniard movement. Aside from that, he was the co-founder of La Solidaridad with fellow co-founder Graciano Lopez Haina. Ponce was also the head of the literary section of the Asociación Hispano-Filipina, created to aid the propaganda movement, where he served as secretary. Next is Jose Alejandrino. He was a Philippine Republican Army general during the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War. He was one of the members of the propaganda movement which demanded equality, especially equal opportunities in the colonial administration for Spaniards and Filipinos. Aside from that, he was also a contributor to La Solidaridad, an organization composed of Filipino liberals living abroad since year 1872 and mostly attending different universities across Europe. So that group aimed to increase Spanish awareness to the needs of its colony, the Philippines, and to foster a closer relationship between the archipelago and Spain. Jose Alejandrino is Rizal's roommate in Belgium. Alejandrino was the one who canvassed printing press for El Pili. He also delivered proofs and revisions to the publisher F. Meyer van Loo in Ghent, Belgium. For his assistance, Rizal gave him the El Pili's corrected proofs and the pen used in doing the corrections. And aside from that, he also helped distribute copies of the said manuscript. Having helped Rizal in correcting errors in the El Pili, Alejandrino might have been the first person to read the novel aside from the author. The next propagandist was Felix Resurrección Hidalgo. He was also a Filipino artist. He is acknowledged as one of the great Filipino painters of the late 19th century and is significant in Philippine history for having been an acquaintance and inspiration for members of the Philippine Reform movement. It is said that he did not directly participate in the Philippine Reform movement, but still he called center members of the movement friends, including Jose Rizal and Mariano Ponce. and left lasting impressions on them through his art. The next is Pedro Paterno. He was a Philippine politician and famous for being a turncoat. He was also a poet and a novelist. He is the so-called peacemaker of the revolution and was born in Santa Cruz, Manila. His greatest contribution to the country was his role as a mediator in the Pact of Biak na Bato on December 14, year 1897, in which this led to peace agreement between the Spaniards and the Filipinos. There is also an account of which he published in year 1910. At the trial of Jose Rizal in year 1896, it was suggested that Paterno, along with Rizal, had incited the Katipunan because they had both written about the ancient Tagalog civilization. So, as the evidence for their complicity, the Spanish prosecution cited Paterno's earlier work, which is the Antigua civilization, as promoting ideas which had consequences both erroneous and injurious to Spanish sovereignty. Nobody moved against Paterno, however, because he was close to the significant number of Spanish officials, both military and civilian, who could vouch him. Thus, Paterno, like many others of the Manila elite, distanced himself from the events of the Katipunan Revolution. The last propagandist was Jose Maria Panganiban. He was a Filipino propagandist, linguist, and essayist. He is one of the main writers and contributors for La Solidaridad, writing under the pen names Homapa and JMP. Being one of the writers of the La Solidaridad, he called the attention of the Spaniards on the freedom of the press and criticized the educational system in the Philippines. By that, his works were recognized by Jose Rizal, who even said that he was a true orator of easy and energetic words, vigorous in concepts and of practical and transcendental ideas. So those are the propagandists and persons that are involved and had relationship with Rizal. So now let's move and discuss the Rizal's growth as a propagandist and disavowal of assimilation. So let us first define the goals of the propaganda movement. The main goals of the propaganda movement was to create reforms in the Philippines. The students who created the movement wanted the Philippines to be acknowledged as a province of Spain and to be represented in the Spanish Cortes. According to this movement, the status of the Filipinos and Spaniards was supposed to be equal, as well as the human rights, for example, freedom of speech and press. And one of the main goals was also to secularize parishes of the Philippines. And its members, the propagandists, who consisted of upper-class Filipinos, created the movement not only for the political purposes, but the most importantly, for the cultural reasons. They aimed to open Spaniards' eyes to the needs of their country and to bind together both countries more closely. Propagandists were patriots who waged their movement by means of pen and tongue to expose the defects of Spanish rule in the Philippines and the urgency of reforms to remedy them. The propagandists were students with a good education, and ideal examples of Filipino manhood, with patriotic minds and brave souls. Some of the most influential members of the propaganda movement consist of: the first is Jose Rizal, second is Graciano Lopez Haina, and Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and many more propagandists. However, the most remarkable of the members is claimed to be Jose Rizal. He was a writer, ophthalmologist, scholar, and scientist. He was born in year 1861 into a Chinese family, and from the beginning he showed a substantial intelligence. After graduating from the University of Madrid, his career stretched onto two dimensions. One was becoming a leader and a spokesperson of the society created among Filipino students in many cities of Europe. And the second one was creating close relationships with scientists, mostly the ones from Germany. Because Rizal was very interested in anthropology, and he wanted to prove wrong the stereotypes of Filipino which were created among many people by presenting his scientific arguments. He also wrote the two novels, which is the Noli Me Tangere from year 1886 and El Filibusterismo from year 1891, which were the factors that influenced the Filipino evolution of national consciousness. And even though both novels were banned, some of the copies spread among Filipino people and gained a broad range of readers in no time. Rise of the propaganda movement. So the conditions in the Philippines after year 1872 worsened. The Filipino leaders were deported in the Spanish disciplinary districts and the intellectuals were put on the trails. As the assaults done by Spanish became unstoppable, many Filipino students gathered in different places all around the world, such as London, Singapore, and Madrid. So those Filipino students, their established goal was to bring happiness to their homeland and encourage social security. The campaign called Propaganda Movement, which they had created, fought aggressively but peacefully at the same time with the Spanish system by the use of words in form of speeches as well as pieces of writing. It has begun in year 1872 at the time when the three Catholic priests, Jose Burgos, Jacinto Zamora, and Mariano Gomez, were killed and executed by garrote. Weakening of the propaganda movement. The arrest of Rizal, as well as the fall down of the La Liga Filipina, began the weakening process of the propaganda movement. Shortly after that, in year 1895, La Solidaridad stopped to be published and Lopez Haina died. Moreover, even though some people tried to re-establish La Liga Filipina, their actions ended in failure. Filipinos used the propaganda movement as a medium in their pursuit for independence from Spain. The whole movement began as gentle actions and advices created by students from the Philippines who attended universities in Europe. Because of the fact that the level of education provided at that time in the Philippines was low and offered mostly in Spanish, which Filipino did not know that well, and many young people followed their education path abroad. After seeing what is happening in other countries, how free people seem to be in Europe, they also wanted to do something about the bad conditions in their homeland. This is how the propaganda movement was created. The propagandists used literature to create change and in the way provide people with knowledge. La Solidaridad, the organ of the propaganda movement. A newspaper founded by Graciano Lopez Haina in Barcelona on February 15, year 1889. While on December 15, 1889, Marcelo H. Del Pilar replaced Graciano Lopez Haina as its editor. So, La Solidaridad was created due to the reality that the mass media is important in propagating the propaganda objectives. End of propaganda movement. Rizal's arrest to the Pitan marks the end of the propaganda movement, so that the radical members like Andres Bonifacio separated from the movement. believing that it was useless to expect from the Spaniards. Because of that, they created the group Los Compromisarios, which is a group organized in purpose of prolonging the movement. It is said there that each member promised to contribute financially to aid the propaganda movement in Spain. Among the active members were Apolinario Mabini, Domingo Franco, Numeriano Adriano, Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista, Timoteo Paez. For some months, the compromisarios sent funds to Marcelo H. del Pilar in Madrid for the continued printing of La Solidaridad. But later on, many members stopped paying their contributions so that the flow of funds to Spain ceased. For lack of funds, La Solidaridad died after its last issue on November 15, year 1895. With the demise of the Solidaridad, the propaganda movement consequently ended. Yes, the propaganda movement failed, but the ideas of freedom and justice which it sowed paved the ground for the Philippine Revolution that the Katipunan and Andres Bonifacio began in the hills of Balintawak in August year 1896. Despite its political spirit, the propaganda movement produced certain meritorious literary works which contribute to the blossoming of Filipino literature. And in the end, we can say that Jose Rizal, as a propagandist, became one of the forerunners of the propaganda movement that awakened the Filipino people from the abuses of Spanish colonizers. And because of Rizal's propaganda movement, he served as the mouthpiece of the injustices and grave human rights violations that the Filipino people went through during the Spanish rule. So that would be the end of my discussion. Again, I am Shaira G. Pabro. Thank you.